I'm RJ, and this is the Lynx Express version 4 video assembly manual. Now, the idea behind this was quite simple. Hopefully I can build a Lynx Express here for you and come up with an edited video that doesn't drag out too long, but will give you a step-by-step detail of building an Express. And guess what? We won't do it at super high speed where you can't keep up. Basically, we're going to get started. There's a few things we need. Soldering iron, of course. Solder. We're going to need our Express kit. Now, this is the Express version 4 board we're going to start with, and it should come in a kit if you've bought a kit. If not, you should have bought the board from me and bought the parts yourself. If you brought a kit, you probably got a static sensitive bag like this with your static parts. You should have got a bag like this with non-static sensitive parts, your connectors, your resistors, things like that. You should have received a transformer in your kit, and you should have received a heat sink kit. Very important. Your screws, your isolator washers, your spacers, and such. Okay. We're going to set this aside till near the end of the assembly. Okay. Now, a couple other things I recommend. Some needle nose, some cutters, of course. But one very important thing is another PCB board of about the same size. I've got a freestyle board hanging around, so I'll use it for the moment. It'll work perfectly. We'll set this to the side, and you'll see what we're going to use that for here in a little bit. Now, I don't like to particularly breathe in solder fumes, so I have a solder filter fan, fume extractor, smoke absorber, whatever you want to call it. So we'll have a little bit of noise as I solder, but hopefully you'll hear me just fine. Basically, how I like to get started is with a clean board. And the first thing I like to do is I like to start out by putting all my smallest parts in. I highly recommend that you put your smaller parts in. Now, to start that out, let's start with our non-static sensitive parts. The first thing I want you to do is, before we get to this point, is I want you to go through all of your parts, make sure you have what you're supposed to have. I want you to make sure you understand the difference between the different parts and what they are. Okay? And I'll talk about them as I go along. Basically, I'm going to dump these parts out on the bench. And the first thing I'm looking for is resistors, the little 0.1 microfarad capacitors that look like this, look like little orangey bulbs on leads. 2 sets of resistors. Now I'm going to warn you, because the version 4 uses less resistors than the previous versions, and because I'm working with a version 3 kit, I have more resistors than I actually need, and that's okay. Doesn't hurt anything. We're going to deal with it as we go. If you've got a version 3 kit, just means, or 2 kit, just means you won't use some of the parts that you have. If you've got a version 3 kit, you should have exactly what you're supposed to have. Okay? Basically, looking here, we've got one set of resistors that have quite a few, and one set of resistors that have about half that much. Okay? Basically, that means that these resistors are 330 ohm resistors. But do I want to trust that? No. Now, in the manual, there's a color scheme you can look at. But I'm going to give you a little hint. Most of us have done this a long time, especially people who are partially color defective, as I am, and who'd have better things to do with their time and don't want to risk it. We'll pull out a manual, put it on ohm, and say, what do we got? Okay. And in this case, if I can get on it, we have 324.8 ohms, which is a 330. Okay. Well, interestingly enough, I only need one of these with this new version 4. All of them but one went away. So let's take that resistor off and lay it on our board. And take these extra resistors and let's get them the heck out of the way. Okay? Now, take my meter and set it aside. We'll need it again later. Now, with that in mind, we know that this is a 330 ohm resistor. Okay? I myself like to point the color schemes of the resistors in a similar direction, just to make the board look a little more manufactured. So I usually look for the value, oh, I'm trying to think of what they call it, the tolerance value, I'm sorry. In this case, they're gold. Most of the resistors we use are 5%, so they're gold. Well, I actually bend my resistors ahead of time, and I kind of know where all my pliers here to put to bend to get about the right length. So now I'm going to take, and I see the gold stripe here, and I'm going to pick and decide where I want the gold stripe. And the gold stripe in this case is going to go down. I'm going to find the only 330 resistor spot there is. Okay. I'm going to take my pliers and I'm going to pull it in nice and tight, push over just a little so it'll stay. Okay. That's right here for you, if you can see. Okay. It actually is a resistor that controls the current to one of the LEDs on the board. Actually, it's the 5-volt OK LED. Okay. With that in place, we're going to just keep on going. We know that all of these should be 180, but again, I'm going to reach over here and turn my meter back on. I'm going to verify. There's nothing worse than building a board and finding out that you thought something was something and it wasn't. That's a bad mistake. All you have to do is read very little on the forums, on the do-it-yourself forums, and you'll see that happening to people on a regular basis. It's not worth it. Take your time. Additional 10 minutes of build time can save you hassle, heartache, and a lot of work. Okay? You want this thing to work the first time out, so take your time. These are in fact 180. I'm going to take one of the 180s. I'm going to bend it. And I'm going to put it in place. Now, to be totally honest with you, normally I use my big magnifying lens over here to do my soldering and stuff. It's not going to be very conducive to do that with you guys on the video. You wouldn't be able to see anything. So we're going to have to do this one without the help of it. Now, I also put the gold stripe down so that the resistors look like they were put in the same direction. Okay, make everything look as nice as I can. Now, that's 2 resistors ready to be soldered in. Now, what other small parts are there? Well, there's a whole bunch of 180s right along here, so we need to put all of those in. I'm going to do that now. And probably this will be edited in the video some, so I probably won't sit here and talk that much. Now, there's not near as many of them as I have resistors because, again, I got rid of a whole lot of parts out of the version 4 for us. So let's pull out some of these and I will get them put in. Okay. You might notice that I've thrown some weight on the board and kind of hung the board out. Let's put the resistors through without having a problem with them hitting on the bench. Now what we're going to do is, now that I've put the 16 resistors, all of the gold bands down, just for looks. You don't have to do that if you don't want to. I've got my 2 resistors up here by my LEDs, right to the left where it says Links Express on the board in big letters. I've got my 3 little orange blob capacitors to put in now. Okay? Now, these are going to be put in just like the resistors did. Some of you may wonder, if you're fairly new to doing this, why would I want to put all these small things in first? Well, there's a very good answer to that. Because when I flip it over in a second to solder it, I want all of these little items to lay on my bench and be held up tight. Okay? Now, why is that a benefit? Well, because if we put them in, flip them over and have the bench hold them up tight to the board when we solder them, the part is held tight against the board, and you don't end up with things sticking up off the board looking very unprofessional. And not only that, your legs are then long, which makes them, not able to take as much beating. One of the great things of solid state electronics was, of course, that items didn't stick way up off the board and have a lot of momentum to get broke easy. Just inertia from shaking things made the electronics prior to solid state much more fragile. Solid state electronics stays close to a board. There's very little arm for momentum. Inertia has not much to work on when you in an impact. So they tend to stand up a lot better. So we want to keep our stuff like it is. Now, there's an argument the resistor should actually be a little up off the board, and there's some truth to that. But none of the stuff you're going to be dealing with here runs that much current that is generating any heat. So don't worry about the little technical details of resistors being slightly off the board and such in our situation. As you can see, I've got one of those capacitors going here. This is again the 0.1 UF microfarad. They're little pill-shaped shapes. And one goes at the very top of the PIC chip, the 24FJ chip. So that's two that are right by the top of the chip, and one over on what would be the right normally. I have the board upside down. Of course, you're looking at it from a funny angle anyway. Now, all of those items are in. So I'm ready for my first solder bout. So I'm going to hold it up and let you guys see what we've done. This is what we've done parts-wise. Hopefully you can see that halfway decent. Okay. So now we're going to solder. Okay. The trick, of course, is getting all the parts flipped over without falling out. That's where the other board comes in. Just lay the board, the second board on. Okay. Flip it over. Lay one edge on. Let gravity hold it down now. Slide it in. And voila, no problem. Now, it's time to solder. A couple things about soldering. Soldering is really, really easy. People make it much harder than it is. First thing is good temperature. Good temperature with your soldering gun. Your soldering iron needs to be the right temperature. Okay. Too cold, you're just kind of blobbing mashed potatoes on there. You're just blobbing solder. You're not really soldering. Soldering requires enough temperature to actually cause the metallurgic actions to happen. That happens when the solder and the parts, the board, the part, and the solder are all warm enough. All of them. All three. Not one, not the other, all three. I can take solder and stick it on the tip of a soldering iron and melt it all day long. That's not soldering. That's melting solder. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our soldering iron, we're going to get the temperature right. Hopefully you've got a temperature-based controlled soldering station. If you do, everybody's different. See the smoke coming on? That's what we got a smoke absorber for. I'm going to hear it come on. It's going to keep me from breathing that stuff. Traps it in the charcoal. Okay, I've just tinned my soldering iron. I have some solder. Electronic solder. If you're new to soldering, there is solder that's called acid core. It's for plumbers. We don't use that. Okay? So, let's start soldering. First thing I like to do, other than cleaning my tip on a regular basis and tinning it, is tack the parts on one side. I do that because it gives me a chance to flip the board over and make sure I'm happy with what I've got. If I'm not, I can adjust it still. I'm going to put the iron basically at a 45 degree in contact with the pad and the lead. I'm going to add a little solder at the solder tip, but then I'm going to move it around the back. Why? Well, because of two things. The first being that when I put the tip down on the parts, the heat transfer is not optimal. The area is just not there. So to help with that, by putting just a little solder on the tip and the part where they contact, the solder will melt due to the heat of the iron, and it will create a large area of clean, well-conductive area to transfer my heat to my part. But why don't I just keep feeding solder in? Because the iron's hot, and you may be just melting solder, not soldering. We want to make sure you're making a connection. So what we want to do is then take our solder and go around the back side of the lead and melt it against the lead. That means we know the part and the board are hot enough to melt the solder well. Now, if I get on a part and do that, and it doesn't solder very quickly, I'm sitting there for a couple seconds, I need to get my soldering iron off. Something's not right. I don't want to sit there and cook parts. Everyone worries about cooking parts, so what do? They turn their temperature down. When they turn their temperature down, the soldering won't happen, so they stay on the part trying to get it soldered, and they damage parts. It's not about the temperature, it's much more about how long you're on the part. You can be a lot hotter than you need as long as you're on the part for just a very short time. If you're too cold, you spend too much time on the part. So don't be afraid to turn your heat up a little. Right now I'm running right at about 340 degrees C. I normally run 330, 340 for typical joints. Get into big stuff, I crank it on up. We'll talk about that. Now, I'm going to move along. Okay. Now, I've soldered one half of each of the resistors in small parts, capacitor resistors. So I'm going to flip it over and do a little exam. Right off the bat, I can see a problem. If you look right there, look at that. That capacitor standing straight up. Must have come off the edge of the board or something. Maybe that was a mistake. Maybe I did that intentionally to show you this. I won't tell. Basically, because I only did one side of it, it's a piece of cake to fix. All I do is take my needle nose, I grab the lead, I put down a heat, allow it time to get hot and melt, pull up slightly, take soldering iron off, let it solidify. And you see how quick I fix that problem? So that might be a reason why you want to do half first, so you don't end up with a bunch of things standing off your board. Now, if everything else looks good, all of my joints look good and they're in place, then I'm ready to do the other half. Nice thing about it is I don't have to worry about them too much because the part's pretty well where it's going to be at the moment. So now I'll go back to soldering. Okay, we're done. I'll let you get a look at that for what you can see. Lots of leads sticking off. Everything is, all my resistors, all my capacitors are soldered up alright. Now, we need to get rid of some leads. You do what you want to. I basically take my nippers and, what I call my nippers, diagonal cutters, and I trim them bad boys. Alright, now we've trimmed off the leads, so we have our first set of things done. What do we need to move to next? Well, what you want to do is you want to move up in height as you go along. Okay, you want to take and move up, 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 up in height. Okay, there are some other resistors. You'll probably find them in a little bag like this. Again, open up, dump out. Get the resistors because they're going to be short items. Okay, there we go. What do we have? We got 5 resistors. We need to know what they are. So again, our meter is our friend. Now, normally, never trust a part. Sorters make mistakes. Mausers and companies like that make mistakes. We put our meter on, the little blue resistor, and we find out that it's 119.8. That's pretty close to 120. Well within tolerance. So that tells me, as I suspected with this blue resistor, normally we use this particular resistor and it's kind of a bluish color, that this is my 120 termination resistor. So I'm going to take my magnifying glass, take a look at it, find my band for tolerance, put it one certain direction, your choice whatever you want to. I'm going to find the location just above the little terminator area here that says 120 and put the 120 resistor in. Okay, now these 5 resistors we're dealing with are all up in here, so I'm going to turn the board around like this so I can stick them through without problem. I'm going through and look. First thing I notice is I've got 3 resistors that have the same colors, so I pretty well know those are my 3 4.7s. Still not going to trust it though. Take my meter and take a look at the last one, the next oddball. And it comes up to 1.958 kiloohms. Sounds like a 2K to me. It is. This resistor's job is to control the ZC signal and make sure that it gets generated correctly. So right over here, right below the transformer area, mark 2K. Put it in. Again, I'm putting my gold band in this case. Same direction as the rest of them to make it look a little more machined. Okay. Now, what else? Well, we got these 3 resistors. Let's check them. Should be 4.7K resistors. 4.6K, that's within tolerance. So these are my 4.7s. So I'm going to bend them and install them. They go all the way to the top of the board up here. You'll see 3 4.7s. If you're working in an area and you want these to hang off, all it takes is a little bit of extra weight. Throw something like a transformer if you haven't put it in on. Okay. Put them in place. Let's solder them. If you read the forums very long and do it yourself forums, you'll figure out real quickly that most of the problems that people trying to build these things is bad solder joints. Parts turn backwards, that kind of thing. Spend you a few extra minutes. Don't get in a rush. There's no reason to get in a rush. Take time to look over your work. Make sure you're happy with it. Make sure the joints look good. If they don't, redo them. It's only a few minutes. Considering how long it might take you to troubleshoot and fix the problem later. Don't get in a hurry to get something soldered. Especially the first couple you build, take your time. The reality is, people tend to have less problems with their first board other than putting things in backwards or wrong. They have more trouble with their second or third board because once they've done it once, they think, just throw it together, I know how to do it. And that's when they make mistakes. Okay. So we've done that. As you can see, we've populated a little more of our board. We're just moving right along. Not making near the speed that I normally would because I'm talking. I'm thinking about what I'm doing for you guys. Okay. Now we have to decide, what are we going to put in next? Well, there's a tiny little capacitor of 2700 picofarad. Little tiny little rascal. I'm going to show it to you right here. If you can make it out, it's pretty small. And it goes right here, right in front of the big wide chip for the display. It's marked as 2700 PF, little square. It will drop in. It will fall right back out to and get lost on the floor in a heartbeat, trust me. Speaking of experience, I do dumb stuff on a regular basis. So, get it in there and solder that rascal. Okay, that's in place. You can see it there. Okay, hopefully you can see right up here. Right there. Okay, now with that in place, looks similar to the other capacitors, but it is, the legs point straight down the same direction, and it's a little bit of a bulbier look. Okay, with that done, we have to decide, what are we going to put in next? Well, this is kind of a debated thing here, because when I do these, I always argue with myself about which to do next. Your best choices are your LEDs or your sockets. And I always go back and forth. If I put an LED in and look at it, and I put a socket in and look at it, what I'm going to find, and I'm going to open up my static bag and get a socket out. And I recommend you grab a grounded thing like your grounded soldering iron, or there's all kinds of grounded items I have here that I grab. My knee is actually against the bench, which is hooked to natural earth ground. That's my little trick I don't normally tell. If you hook your metal, you have a metal workbench, and you ground it, and you've always got your bare feet on it, your knee against it, really hard to static zap parts. And you know what? Another little secret, in Florida's not that easy to static zap things anyway. Our humidity is like 80%, so it'd be done, but not near like dry areas. If I take and drop in a socket right next to that and look at it, what I see is they are so close to the same heights, it's unbelievable, okay? So it's all a big toss-up. So what I do is I typically usually do my LEDs, okay? How do I do them? Well, I set it up close to where all the holes for the LEDs are off my bench where I can put them all in. I put as much weight up here as I need to hold the board good for me, so it doesn't fall over and spill all my stuff, like that. And then I put them in. Now, here's an important tip. Very important tip. If you look at the LED, I don't know how well you can see a lot of this stuff, I'm sorry, but if you look at the LED real close, you'll notice that one of the legs before you start butchering this piece is longer than the other. Okay? That's important because there's a flat spot on it, most LEDs that tell you similar information, but on these it's very difficult to see. The long leg is much easier. That is your anode, your positive side. On the board, if you look closely on your LEDs, I marked it with a plus right next to the hole. It's extremely important that you make sure you put the longer leg in the plus hole. Otherwise, you're going to be a very, very unhappy camper when you get done. Take a moment and make sure you're doing it right. Long leg that sticks down a little more, goes in the plus hole, which is the round hole, not the square one, and has a plus next to it. The reason it has a plus next to it is because it's so easy to mess up. Trying to make y'all's life simpler building these things. Now, I've set these up so the LEDs will go flush with the board. They have a little spot where they kind of want to stop. Take them all the way to the board. I know somebody's going to send me something telling me LEDs are supposed to stand up off the board. Just take them all the way to the board. Trust me. Okay, those are in. Now, you're going to have a couple extra LEDs because up here is a spot that says 5 volt, 5 VOK and 3.3 VOK. The same thing applies to them. There's a plus to one side. They're opposite. The plus to the 5 volt one is towards the top of the board. The 3.3 is to the bottom. Make sure the long lead goes in the hole for the plus. These are your power good indicators. One of the little features we've added to improve the system for you as time went on. Now, how are we going to flip these over and solder them? The old board trick. Now, what if you ain't got a PCB board the right size or whatever? It's okay. Take a notebook. Take something that's got a hard surface that's flat and use it. Okay? Lay it over it. The trick here is don't try to squeeze and hold things. Just try to flip and let go and let gravity hold it in the best you can. Okay? Now, you'll notice that it'll tilt one direction. There's no problem with that. All you do is tilt it back until they're laying level and put you a little weight somewhere to hold it. That's all. Now, what I like to do to get nice looking LEDs is I first tack down one side of the LED, then I go back and take the pliers and pull slightly up so the LED's bottom flattens against the board, and I touch it long enough to reflow the solder, and that way when I'm done they're all perfectly flat and pointing straight out. You don't have them different heights and all over, okay? That's why I do it. So we're gonna do that. Okay, I've tacked them all on one side. Get my spare board out of there. See, I've tacked them, but if you look closely, they're all pointing all over the place. You know, they're just not exactly real straight and everything, if you follow me. So this is where this comes in. What I do is, my glasses back on, because without my magnifying glass, which would be in your way, I'm not a young guy anymore. Put your board down flat as you can, grab it, keep this, don't pull until the solder is flowed fully. Pull up a little and let go of the soldering iron. What that'll do is I'll make the LEDs seat, the flat bottom of this LED seat, and it'll end up with a bunch of straight LEDs. Just a little something, no big secret or miracle. Works okay though for me. Okay, now that extra little time, I'm going to put it up, hopefully you can see, extra little time rewarded me with LEDs that are perfectly straight, pointing straight up, all of them. Looks like a machine put them in. Okay. Now we flip it over and we have all the other sides of the LEDs to solder now. Now, all those are soldered in place. Okay. Let me tell you a little trick about it. What happens if you get too much solder on one lead of something? Get a big nasty blob down there and you're like, let me get my braid, let me get my solder sucker, let's get it all cleaned up. Let me give you a little trick. Again, many of you will know this. I'm not trying to talk down to people who know what they're doing. This video is to try to help people getting into do-it-yourself stuff. If you're soldering and you get a bunch of big blob on there, or maybe you look at it after you're done and you say, I got a big blob there. Here's what you do. Put your soldering iron back down there. Get it good and hot. Don't get in a rush. Make sure it's flowed good. It's very liquid. Keeping the soldering iron in contact with the lead, quickly slide it up the lead. The heat will draw some of the solder with it and pull some of it away. And slide up the lead and take its iron off. It'll harden right. It'll harden. It'll cool right there. Now you're just going to clip that off with the lead and get rid of it. And that's a quick way of getting rid of some of your excess solder. It works very, very well. Okay. Now we just have to clip off our leads of our LEDs, and the LEDs are in. Okay. Here's where we are now. We've got a few parts on our board. We're coming along just fine. Okay. Let's talk about what we're going to do next. Okay. Well, the next thing from a height point of view is your sockets. Now, some people don't recommend using sockets. I do. If it was me, I was building these boards for me, never going to use them for anyone else, I probably wouldn't. Okay? But because I do this for do-it-yourselfers to be able to do themselves also, it's a wise move in my opinion to put the sockets on. You'll hear lots of horror stories about sockets being big problems, and the truth is a socket put in well and a chip inserted correctly, short of putting it in a paint shaker or in an automotive environment or somewhere where vibration is a big deal, you should have very little to no problem at all ever. In fact, we should just not see problems with them. Okay. Not inserted straight and correct, well, that's our fault. That's not the socket's fault. That is the truth. We don't have vibration in our environments. These things sit out in the yard. I mean, we don't exactly drive, they're not on jet aircraft or trains or whatever. Let's start with some sockets, okay? Basically, we just want to put all our sockets in, okay? Now, the sockets are all plugged into static foam, at least with the kits that Dad's been doing and Bill's been doing. If you look at the socket very carefully, there is one end with a notch in it. Okay? If you look on the silk screen, that's the white printing on the board, you will see that there is silk screen that has a notch in the top. They should match. If they didn't, if you messed up, it would not be the end of the world, but you'll want to do it right. You can still insert the chip the right way, it just looks like it's in the wrong way. Now these are the digit sockets. I'm going to put them in. They're 14-pin sockets. They go right here, digit 1, 2, and 3. And then you really can't mess up with sockets too much because they're different sizes. Here's our big wide chip. Again, notch in one end. Pay attention to the notch on the silk screen, the print. Okay, it's going to go in there. This one's kind of hard to mess up too because it's a long chip socket. That's the big chip socket, 28 pin. You've got two 8-pin sockets that are close to being like the little 6-pin, just a little bit extra set of pins. They go, one goes right here. You can see where I'm working. Okay. And one goes right here. So both of them are close to where your sockets for DMX in and out 2 are. Here, right here. Okay. Now, you got the lovely 6 pins. There's optos for every channel, so that's 16. In reality, you have 17 because there's another chip. It has to do with the ZC, 0 cross. Right over here, that's 6 pin. Same type of socket. Look at it. It's different. It's backwards. It's the opposite direction. The notches at the other end. Put your sockets in right. Okay, we've got our sockets in. I'm going to take our static foam, which still has our chips, put it back in our static bag. Don't need them. Put them out of the way. Keep them safe. Okay? Now, it's time to get these soldered in. Okay? We're going to use our board trick again to hold them when we flip them over. Pretty straightforward. One more time, make sure you've got them all in the right place and they're all pointing the right direction. Okay? Right now, I see I made a mistake. See how extremely important it is? That brief second of look over can make a big difference, okay? Say why you want to do that. Now, take our board. These look good. Going to lay this down on the board. Again, don't push down. Slide the board off into your, where you can get your fingers under it and lift it up. Put your thumbs up here. Just touch the middle here. Rotate and let gravity do the job of holding it. And set it on the edge of the bench or table or whatever and slide it over. If you try to push down, because things aren't even, the board will tip between each other and parts will fall out and you just messed up what you're attempting to do. Okay? Now, at this point what I'm going to do, and of course I'm going to use my magnifying glass, is I'm going to take every socket, I'm going to do diagonal pins. Like pin 1, say it's a 8-pin socket. Pin 1 and pin 5. Okay? Diagonal. One pin on one side of the socket on one end, the opposite end on the opposite side. That holds it in good. I'm going to tack all of them that way, and then I can get my board out of my way and I can actually start soldering all these sockets, which is a little time consuming, especially if you're not real quick with soldering. So that's what I'm going to do now. Okay, a little tip here which leads into what I'm talking about. When you're doing these sockets, if you'll go to one of the middle pins on one side, push it all the way to one side lightly, don't bend it, and then tack your pin, you'll be pushing all the pins of that socket to one side of the hole because the pins don't fit the holes real tight. What that will do is that means that all of the sockets then will line up down a row. They won't be one on this side, one on this side, crook this way, crook that way. Even though it's a little bit, it shows when you have a bunch in a row. So what I do is I take and put my soldering iron, go over, and then tack. And that makes sure that I get nice straight rows. It's even more important with the digits. And the digits, make sure that the digit sockets are all the way over and you tack them, all three of them, all the way over the same direction so that your gap between your displays are exactly the same. Otherwise, they get twisted in different gaps and they look funny. They don't line up perfect. Okay. We have now got all of our sockets tacked down in just a few places. They're not permanent. They're not done by no means. A lot of solder joints to be made. So we get our little board, extra board, out of the way. See, we ended up with our sockets. Very straight, very level. Same gap in between these sockets here, so when I plug in the displays, they look good. Okay. Now, It's just a long, tedious process, if you will. It's not that, but you have to solder every pin that you haven't got, and you might even want to touch the pins that you tacked in to make sure you get a good joint on. Take your time. There's a lot of solder joints on this, and that's going to, it's going to be whether it works or not. If you rush through and you miss some pins or you don't get a good solder joint, you might have problems. We don't want that. This is all about making you successful. Much of what we do is trying to make the product better for you and make it where it's easier for you to build. That's why we do kits with all the parts together. We do all this stuff. We keep people from making multiple versions of our stuff. We don't let 14 different versions of the firmware out with little things changed in it. The idea is to make it clean and straightforward for you. It's this goes in here and it works. That's it. There's no choices. There's no. That's kind of what we're trying to accomplish. Okay. So now I'm just going to start soldering these joints. All of our sockets are now soldered complete. Get up here and I don't know what all you can see, how well you can see in the camera. Sorry about that, doing the best I can. With all that soldered in, we have a good start on our board now. Now, the next thing we're going to put in is the last resistors to be put in. Now these resistors are larger than any of the other resistors you have. Probably still ought to fire up your meter like I'm fixing to and verify them. We're going to take and install these. Now these resistors bend right at the resistor. Okay, no extra hangout. Okay. That's how I do them. I just take my finger and I make them bend at a nice round bend where they don't have stress. And then of course I take my gold 5% tolerance value, put it to the same size as I did all the other resistors I did, and they go right here, just below where the transformer is going to go. There's two positions for 15K resistors. Put them in on the board. If you ever really look at the express board, you'll notice that with your heat sink in place, part of its job is makes it kind of hard to get your fingers into where you can get zapped down there where it's all marked high voltage. Okay. And it's another set of parts that we have got into our system. Okay. Now, what are we going to put in next? Well, I like to put my 200 microfarad capacitors. So these little rascals right here, they're blue and black typically. They're marked 100. There's a black stripe with a negative sign on one side. Important point. Make sure that is the negative black stripe is away from the plus sign. Again, you'll also notice that one lead is longer than the other, if you can make that out and see that, okay? If you can, they're just like the LEDs. The long lead is the positive. Now, they go right where I've just put this one on the board. Okay, there's place for two of them. Make sure that the longer lead, which is the side away from the black negative stripe, goes in the positive hole. Otherwise, you'll have a bad time. And basically, tack one side of them, just like I did the LEDs, and then take your pliers while reheating the joint, pull up slightly to get them to bottom out clean against the board. Okay, trim the leads off. They're in there. They're nice and straight. See how nice and straight it made them? Okay, those are in now. Hope if I got it in the camera, didn't it? Okay. Okay, with that in, we have to decide what we're going to put in next. I usually put the fuses in next. Okay, take a fuse, take the little clips, Look at the clip closely. They're not the same. One side of the fuse clip is different. It has little ears bent in. The end that has the ears bent in goes to the outside of the fuse. That's what keeps the fuse, when you pop it in, from sliding out. So when you pop it in, the fuse will slide out one way, but if you do it right, the ears will prevent it from going but so far in. Take another one of your clips, do the same thing. Should push together tight, line them up in line, drop them in the holes for the fuse. Take your needle nose pliers, flip your board over while holding this flush, hold that fuse nice and flush, and bend these, what sticks out of the board, over just a little. Hold the fuse, okay? Now, do that exact same thing with the other fuse, and then solder it. Now, the fuses are big heat sinks. These clips are big heat sinks. There's big power traces going to these. Now, I do not have what's called thermal release, where your hole has little ears that isolate so that the temperature doesn't leak away. But I don't have it on there for a reason. We need quite a bit of current to feed through these, and if I put thermals on there, then I have higher resistant connections, okay? That's not what I want. So now set the board down. Fuses will set. We're going to have to solder. First thing we want to do, big traces where the fuses are. Big clips sticking up that are heat sinks. Big fuse that's a heat sink. I'm going to reach over to my soldering iron and I'm going to crank that temperature up, and I'm not going to be afraid of it. I'm going to take it up to about 395 degrees C. Okay? Now here's the trick. Solder it, get it done, turn your iron back down. Your tip is going to oxidize at a much higher rate. It's going to do more harm to your tip while it's at that high temperature. So we want to keep it to a lesser degree. Now, let the iron come up to temp. Clean the tip. Tin it good, very well. Come over here. Lay the tip down at a low angle across the piece of metal hanging through. And so where I can see a little bit. So that you have the most contact you can with it. And then put a little solder between it. And don't get in a hurry. Let it sit there. Keep it hot. Keep adding a little solder. If it takes a little more solder, let it go. Till you get the whole pad, the whole silver pad has solder on it. Once you're sure of that, give it another 10 seconds or so. Then take your soldering iron away. That'll make a good solder joint. Now immediately jump on the other side of that same clip, because you've already heated up that clip, so you have less heating to do. If you hurry, you won't have to wait as long. So I'm going to feed solder in, feed solder in, feed solder in. Okay, I'm going to leave the iron on there for a little bit. Make sure we flow good. Take the iron away. It'll cool very quickly. That's why we have to have a little extra time with the iron on there. Let's get away while it cools with a nice solder coating on it. Okay, these traces will still be hot. Don't grab them and burn yourself. As you can see, we've got solder joints now, and our fuses are in. We've done it right. Our fuses are flush. They look good. Don't grab the fuses. They're still hot. Okay. That gives us this now. This is what our board looks like at this point. Okay. Now, the next thing I like to put in is these push buttons. Okay? If you look at these push buttons closely, you'll notice that there is a little tiny plastic black tip to one side. Okay? You might even have to look at it real closely. One side in the middle at the end has a little plastic tip. If you look at the board, you will see that there is a hole for those. You can pop these in wrong, even with the hole there, by just having them stick up a little. Look it over, make sure you pop them in right. They actually are designed with the pins to where they have a couple of the pins that are a little bit a little bit bent to a shape that makes them kind of hold in. So I can pop them in and turn them upside down. So that helps you out. Pop them in, turn them upside down, and solder all 6 pins of each one of those. So you got 12 pins of solder. Okay, with that, our push buttons are in place. So now our board looks like this. Okay? Now, at this point, I'm going to break at this moment, and I'm going to come back, and we'll start this again tomorrow. It's kind of late, time to get to bed. We'll start this right where we are tomorrow. I'll edit this right in, and we'll go ahead and we'll finish this board up tomorrow and show you exactly how to finish up these press.